Well, let's get into foreign policy. You're talking about China. We got tons of questions, a huge miss on my part, but I really didn't have time, guys, I promise, to ask you about your thoughts on Ukraine and Russia and the billions and seemingly endless billions of dollars that we are sending over to there.
Yeah, so I'll be clear on a few different things here. First is I would not send another dollar to Ukraine. I think we already have spent far more than we should have. I would not have handled this the way that President Biden did, but I'm running to be president in January 2025. I will tell you that I will not commit. In fact, I will commit not to spending more money in Ukraine. But we've got to go deeper than that to understand what actually put us in this position in the first place. So a big part of what happened is the lack of energy security in the United States. Here's the dirty little secret a lot of people don't know about Biden's spending on Ukraine, okay? With one hand, he gives $110 billion and counting in aid to Ukraine, $40 billion of which was direct cash aid, $60 billion in kind in military contributions. However, with the other hand, this is the part people don't know, Biden was the #1 world leader who lobbied the EU against its ban on Russian oil imports. Why is that? It's because we ourselves shot our ability in the foot here at home to produce fossil fuels, including both oil and natural gas, which increases Europe's dependency on Russia. So think about that. With one hand, we're sending $110 billion to Ukraine, yet with the other, we're effectively lobbying the EU to take steps that would actually allow Putin to continue financing his war machine. That's the senselessness in all of this, is the idea that our own lack of self-confidence at home, and I think it is a lack of self-confidence problem, a self-loathing that causes us to actually take steps like we have in shooting our fossil fuel capabilities here at home. That's what puts us in a weaker position abroad. I also don't want to conflate my position with just saying I'm rooting for Vladimir Putin to win this war. I'm not. I just think that this is a problem for Europe to deal with on its own terms. So you want to talk about being the leader of the free world here? I'm not a commentator. I'm running to actually run this country. Let's get into the specifics. My top foreign policy priorities are protecting our own border, not somebody else's border. And I think it is legitimate to use our military to do it. That is controversial in our defense establishment. It escapes reason as to why, but I'll just tell you, even many of the briefings I get, this is a very controversial topic in the defense establishment, to use our own military to protect our own border. I actually would go further. I think there's an opportunity to use our own military through targeted strikes, drone strikes, air strikes, et cetera, if we devote intelligence resources of the kind we spent in places like Iraq and Syria through the NSA to take on ISIS. We could apply a fraction of that to actually end the fentanyl crisis south of the southern border in the failed narco state that is Mexico. That's a top priority, and that's a symptom of a deeper problem that we face, which is actually taking on China, which ought to be, by and away, our top foreign policy priority. And I have called, and this will not be easy, Candace, I will admit this to you. There will be some sacrifice we may need to be willing to make to declare independence from China, because I think it is impossible for us to succeed on the timescale of history if we're economically dependent on our arch enemy. That was never true of the Soviet Union in the last Cold War. We did not depend on them for the shoes on our feet or the phones in our pockets. Yet today, because we stay silent. If that were a Russian spy balloon, we would have shot it down and ratcheted up sanctions immediately. Part of my sense of urgency to run for president is I understand this Chinese problem deeply. I've been an exchange student in China twice, including at the Harvard of China. I've done business in China. I understand this problem deeply. And I think China's in a vulnerable position where if we pull the economic rug out from under them now, declare independence now, and I can talk about how I would do that, I think we can defeat them economically now so we will never have to militarily later. And I think we get a radical reform of the CCP in response to that if we actually have the courage and conviction to deliver.
Why do you feel that China is vulnerable at this moment?
China's
economically vulnerable.
Economically vulnerable. I think militarily, sadly, their naval capacity is ahead of where ours is, which does not bode well in the South China Sea if you play out the war games vis-a-vis Taiwan. The zero COVID policy gutted China's economy last year. And that the irony is Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy had about as much to do with COVID as the U.S. climate cult has to do with the climate. Both are just forces for dominion and control on different sides of the Pacific, but Xi Jinping went further. He also actually, just read the news today, Alibaba is now breaking itself up at behest of the Chinese government into 6 separate companies, and Jack Ma is nowhere to be found. That's just an example of why he's actually scared the Chinese business community into submission, but that tames the inner animal that has actually the inner beast that has allowed China to grow at 7+% for most of the last couple of decades. That's attenuated significantly over the last year. So I think they're in a vulnerable spot. How do you know Xi Jinping is a vulnerable spot? The white sheet revolution, you know what I'm referring to there, which was last year, Chinese protesting the zero COVID policies. The only way they could protest is they would get arrested if they said something, so they all held up an empty white sheet. But he buckled to that. I think that there's a vulnerability, and he knows it. And so I think if the U.S. shows up, so what I'm about to state is an extreme policy. I'm going to be very honest. It's an extreme policy that I espouse. But I think if we show up and say that most U.S. businesses, maybe even all U.S. businesses, are banned from doing business in China, from entering the Chinese market, unless and until we get this list of reforms from the CCP. No theft of intellectual property, no theft of data, no mercantilist practices where you force U.S. companies like Airbnb to hand over data. By the way, there's Chinese laws that then prevent them from disclosing that back in the U.S. End these, you would call mercantilist practices. That's not capitalism, it's mercantilism. I think if we have the fortitude to say, no, you know what, we recognize that's going to make some sacrifice, but we're still going to take that step in the short run because we're thinking on the time scales of history. You know what we get? I think China has a weaker hand than we do on that economic trade-off. It'll actually hurt them economically while they're vulnerable far more than it will us. I can explain why that's the case, because I'm not saying automatically all of that supply chain comes back to the U.S. Some people in our movement conflate the two, that because if we're declaring independence from China, that means we automatically have to have all of that in the continental United States. I'd love for more of that to be in the continental United States, but that's not my top objective. I'd say if those redundancies are borne by Brazil, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, Western Europe, even West Africa, then I think we actually make this a lot more tractable for us. It's not a binary choice that it has to come to the U.S. Then we'll struggle a lot. But if all of our other allies can pick up the slack of the supply chains that we'd be missing in China and the market opportunities we'd be missing in China, it's actually a lot easier for us to take this on than it would be for China. What I think we then see is radical reform from the CCP. But the key is you have to be willing to make that sacrifice. And the key to success in geopolitics is just like a negotiation in business, is that it's when you're most willing to make a sacrifice that you probably will never have to actually make one. And right now, that's what comes back to what you and I were talking about last time, the revival of this national identity, self-confidence, our national fortitude, our cultural fortitude at home is inextricably linked to our fortitude in our geopolitics abroad. Those aren't separate issues. There's not the culture war over here and the economy over here and foreign policy over there. Our problems in our economy and in our foreign policy are in many ways just a symptom of our loss of cultural fortitude and self-confidence here at home. That's why I'm focused on that. Some of the questions I get in this campaign is, well, you're not focused on kitchen table issues or the technicals of foreign policy. No, I'm actually quite deep in all of those areas. But I think the most important part is actually reviving our cultural fortitude, because if we do that, it then becomes easier to sit across that table from Xi Jinping and deliver the mandate that I just told you about, or to have the self-confidence to put us back to 5% plus GDP growth.